Hello and welcome. My name is Florian Meyer, and today I'm going to present my short paper contribution in which I propose that we should have a closer look at how language skills and language proficiency affect Wikipedia reading behavior. As the title might contain two terms that you are not so familiar with, I want to define them in the beginning here. So multilingualism simply means like speaking multiple languages, right? It is the use of more than one language by an individual speaker or a group of speakers. Of course, the question is, what is a language in the first place? And also the question is of how proficient does one have to be in order to be considered a speaker of a language. Linguists are not quite sure, but overall seen, it is just about how many languages you are able to understand. And a specific version of multilingualism is mutual intelligibility, which is receptive multilingualism. And it is basically understanding multiple languages easily. The definition here says that language pairs are so closely related that the speakers are able to communicate, each using their own language without prior language instruction. And mutual intelligible languages are, for example, Spanish and Portuguese, or Slovak and Czech, and Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian. Those are the three languages that I will later on have a closer look when I investigate the phenomenon on Wikipedia in the Nordic countries, basically. I want to continue to highlight the importance of Wikipedia for the web, because we might not be super aware of that. So you could see Wikipedia is in the center of an information ecology on the web, because it's simply one of the most visited websites overall, right? With the 1.4 billion page views, around 1.4 billion page views per month. A lot of other applications, for example, search engines, of course, like Google, built on the Wikipedia. Like you can see that, for example, Wikipedia links appear in around 60 to more than 80% of all search engine result pages. And Google would simply be a much worse search engine if it couldn't rely on Wikipedia content, on the content that was created by volunteers and by users. Also, when you think about the knowledge cards on the right side, which are almost exclusively Wikipedia content for known item retrieval tasks. Of course, also very important is the aspect that all the algorithms that get trained nowadays, for example, deep learning algorithms and language models like BERT, they rely on the English Wikipedia as training corpus. And in a recent paper, it was also found that in question answering scenarios, like 60% of the public data sets they're used are coming from the English Wikipedia, right? Also there you see that there is a strong connection. And then there is, of course, other connections to be found on other platforms like Reddit. Like if you think about subreddits, like the Today I Learned subreddit, every third linked website there is a Wikipedia link. And also, of course, other big players on the web like Twitter or Facebook, they use Wikipedia content, for example, to fact check their own content that gets posted there. So we can see that the Wikipedia is really important, and we might not always be aware of how important it is and how central it is. But it is not only central for those big players here, but also, of course, for us as single users. But of course, the Wikipedia is not free of, let's say, biases in that sense. Like Wikipedia suffers from so-called knowledge gaps. So one of the most well-known gap is the gender gap. So it is well known that, and I'm not citing any articles here, but there are many out there that show that the editors are mostly male, and that leads to that a lot of content is about male persons. And this also leads then ultimately to also a reader gap, which basically is shown in a very recent survey that says that or 2/3 of all readers are male, which is probably also can be traced back to the fact that it's mostly yeah, male-centric content that is around on the Wikipedia. Yeah, so those knowledge gaps, of course, they threaten Wikipedia's goal of knowledge equity, which basically means that we want to, or they want to give all people equal access to unbiased knowledge around the globe. And as you can see here on the right, this is a visualization of the recently published Wikipedia knowledge gaps taxonomy. So I already mentioned those three areas: content, readers, and contributors that can be affected. And when talking about language and language skills and so on, you're probably here in this right upper corner with the, it affects readers and it affects the representation gaps from a language perspective. So the question basically is also, yeah, how does language skills affect Wikipedia usage? And of course, it is clear that which and how many languages a Wikipedia user can understand impacts considerably what knowledge is available to them. Simply, Wikipedia language editions are of different sizes, and not every language edition is represented at all. So there are, of course, also a lot of languages that don't have Wikipedia Wikipedia edition and so on. And of course, this is connected to the question of what will the future of Wikipedia look like in general, right? So how do we want to extend the Wikipedia also across and grow Wikipedia across other language editions and within language editions where we already have smaller sized Wikipedias in that sense? How can we actually yeah, grow them in that sense? For example, ideas are an abstract Wikipedia where data gets sourced and then automatically articles are written from that data that gets sourced. So multilingual editing in that sense, so contributing to Wikipedia, has been studied before, but how yeah, it affects readers, or how speaking multiple languages and understanding multiple languages, how that affects reading behavior, hasn't. There is some anecdotal evidence that came out recently, which shows that 95% of participants reported to be monolingual and actually relying on a lot of native language editions. Then it also, the same survey showed that English and French Wikipedia are especially essential for non-native speakers in African countries, which makes a lot of sense. Another aspect that occurred in the same data, but from a different analysis, was that around 20% of reader sessions involve the reader switching from one language edition to another. So there is basically evidence that people switch between languages. And the question is, of course, why would they do that? Maybe are they missing content in one that they suppose to be finding in another one, and so on. So in general, it is interesting to see not only within session language switching that might be easy to detect in that sense, but also what happens when people switch across sessions, right? When they have multiple browser tabs open, and in one session they search in the English one, in another one the German one, the Danish one, the French one, and so on. And of course, also what is a problem here is how do, for example, search engines affect the way that people get presented Wikipedia links that they click on, right? And how does that affect what language they might be choosing? So in my initial analysis, as I said, I focused on the usage of Wikipedia in the Nordic countries. I collected data via the Wikimedia REST API to see, like, okay, how are those countries' language editions used by each other in that sense? So, for example, how many Danes would visit the Swedish Wikipedia and such things. Maybe some background information. The three language editions that we're talking about here is the Danish one. That is kind of a small one, you could say. Also still the Norwegian one with 535,000 articles is also among the smaller ones. Then the Swedish one is by far the biggest of those three. And the reason, of course, here is also because it is written by a bot. So most of those articles among the 3.7 million articles are bot articles, which are created, for example, about rivers in Australia and so on. And I mean, this also poses a question on itself, right? So how understandable are those articles, and would users prefer maybe articles that are more written, or where you can sense that they're written from a human and not from a bot automatically. Yeah, those are the three language editions at question. So at first, what I did here is to analyze, as I already mentioned, so for each language editions for those three, where do users actually come from? And following the idea of mutual intelligibility, which is pronounced in the Nordic countries, would basically Danes visit the Swedish one, or in this case, here you see the Danish one, would Norwegian and Swedish people visit the Danish Wikipedia? And yeah, they do, but not to an extent that I was thinking that it would happen, right? You see here that it's only around 0.9%, around 1% of page views to the Danish language edition come from Sweden and from Norway. And similar patterns can be seen for the Norwegian and the Swedish one. Whereas here, maybe you can see a bit of an outlier that the Swedish one is only visited by 0.5% from the Danish, from Danish people. And yeah, to add to that, I also wanted to show the distribution for the English Wikipedia. Of course, that is much more spread out. And here on rank 17, 30, and 32, you can see the three Nordic countries. This brings us also to the next question, basically, how important is then the English Wikipedia to those Nordic countries? And in this time series analysis, basically, you can see that, yeah, there is not much of an overall change in that sense of importance of the English Wikipedia. How this is calculated, you can see in the formula down below. It's basically just a share of all the visits here from the English one to all the shares. Yeah, we can see that there is not much of an overall trend or change, but what you can definitely see here is that as the Danish and the Norwegian Wikipedia lie above 50%, is that they use the English Wikipedia more than their own language edition. And Swedish users actually use their own language edition more than this English one. So now one could hypothesize, is this the case because the Swedish is so huge and has millions of articles, so they don't have the need to go and visit other language editions, for example, the English one? Could be, of course, the case. So there are a lot of research questions coming out of that, and this is only a research proposal in that sense, right? It's not a very deep analysis here. I'm probably bringing much more questions than I bring answers, but things that I want to investigate in the future are, for example, how frequently do Wikipedia users make use of their own language skills and switch between languages? What is the extent of this within and across session language switching? Also, how proficient do users have to be so they would consider to switch to a language? Also, which factors motivate this behavior? So how do information needs, prior knowledge, socio-demographic aspects play a role? Also, how do characteristics of Wikipedia language editions, for example, size, the quality of articles, and so on, and also the share of cultural context content influence the user's choice? There are some methods that I thought about that I want to use in the future. So of course, I want to do some kind of mixed methods approach. I already started doing some qualitative interviews. I think there are like 7 now that have been conducted with users, which should, of course, inform the large-scale questionnaire that should cover that in a larger scale on how users use the Wikipedia in different languages with. And then there's also some kind of computational social science component or kind of data science approach to it that I want to apply. I would like to use the cultural context data set and the Wikipedia Diversity Observatory, which is basically built on the same data set of cultural context. to observe and to study this kind of language scenarios a bit more in detail. And then also what I want to do is, as I recently got an access to the Twitter academic research product track, which allows to basically have a search over all tweets that got posted. I want to collect all tweets with Wikipedia links, and then here also check, okay, what is the relation between languages of the article and the languages of the tweet text and so on. So those are just some ideas and methods that I want to pursue in the next couple of months and years. Summary and conclusions for this. So as I already said, which and how many languages Wikipedia users can understand impacts considerably what knowledge is available to them. However, hardly anything is known about how multilingualism and understanding multiple languages affect that behavior. So by bridging that research gap, of course, this means also bridging knowledge gaps on the Wikipedia. And this initial analysis that I already showed you shows that in the Nordic countries, it might not be super pronounced as I thought or initially estimated, but the Danes and Norwegians quite strongly rely on the English Wikipedia. Thank you for your attention. And I'm now ready, of course, to for your questions.